Good morning. I'm Dave, one of the pastors here, and today we're starting a new sermon series exploring the life of Jesus to discover more than just what he said and did, but why all that matters in the first place. Why he's made such a difference in the world, and why he could matter so much to you personally. Because Jesus is more than just another motivational speaker, teacher, or saint. Jesus is God in the flesh. And that's where things start to get really complicated for a lot of people, because it's not clear who God really is. Is there a God? If so, what's he like? Is he even a he? How could you find him, or her, or them, or it? And how do you know whether what you believe is true? It's a question everybody's interested in, but so many people have suggested so many different answers that it can seem impossible to figure out what's real. Some people tell us that God's all about love, and tons of schmaltzy art promotes that idea. Well, that sure sounds nice, but how do they know? How can I be sure that's true and not just wishful thinking? Because other people wave signs declaring that God hates almost everyone. He hates gays, Republicans, Democrats, Catholics, Muslims, fundamentalists, or Jews, and you. And while that sounds awful, I get the last part, because after some of the terrible things I've said and done, and even worse things I've thought about saying or doing, I could hardly fault God for hating me. Sometimes I hate myself. So why wouldn't God hate me too? Maybe God does. But these people seem so sure. How do they know what God is really like? So some say that God's loving, others that he hates. Still others say that God doesn't care at all. God created the world and then pretty much let go and got on with more important things. We're on our own out here, which is why we see so much suffering and injustice in the world. Well, I guess that makes sense. But it's so different from what the other people said. So how can they be so sure? How do they know? Because other people say that there's no God at all. The ancients just invented God because they wanted explanations but didn't know enough science yet. Well, that's possible. But I wonder again, how do they know? Even though people have been trying for centuries, there are many questions that science still can't answer apart from a creator. And no one's been able to prove that there's no God. So how do they know? Because other people claim there's not just one God, but millions of them. Hinduism recognizes about 330 million at last count. And that's a fascinating possibility. But how do they know it's true? A lot of us are interested in God. But it's hard to know what to believe about him or her or them or it, because self-proclaimed experts say so many different things. Whom should we believe? Well, given all this confusion, even if we want to know God, it's not clear what we're looking for, and that can be frustrating. Have you ever had a time where you felt like you needed God, but you weren't sure where to look or what you should even be looking for? I was very athletic in college until the day that I broke my back. 2 vertebrae snapped, 5 discs slipped, and I couldn't move. I'd only been a Christian for a short time then, and I admit that while I was in the ambulance and hospital, I wondered if the God I believe in were real. How could this happen? As a new Christian, I believed in a God who would prevent anything bad from happening so long as I was good. And I had been. I'm pretty good. So what happened? Did he forget me? Or just not care? Does God even exist? Clearly, the God I believed in didn't exist. I felt lost and so alone. Have you ever had that experience? Back in the late 80s, the Where's Waldo fad swept the nation. A whole series of books filled with ridiculous pictures of people in precarious or hilarious situations, and somewhere, hidden among all that mayhem, is Waldo. The goal is to find him among all those distractions. Now, I don't know if you can see this very well on your screen, but here's one now. Can you find Waldo in this big chaotic scene? I'm going to leave this up for a little while to give you a chance. These things just frustrate me. I know that Waldo must be on the page somewhere, but I can't find him. Even more frustrating is that there are plenty of people who look sort of like Waldo, and other ways that red stripe pattern shows up, which makes it even harder to find the real Waldo. I look and look, but somehow he escapes view even while he's right in front of me. Often, I give up too soon and conclude that, well, this must have been a misprint because this particular picture accidentally omitted Waldo because I can't find him. Those are silly books, but this is one of my favorite illustrations because that's how many of us feel about God. We'd like to find him, but it's almost impossible because we're not exactly sure what to look for and not even sure if he's really here at all. At least we know what Waldo looks like, with his round glasses and striped shirt. But how can we find God unless we know what he looks like? Should we be looking for someone loving? For someone who's angry? Someone who doesn't care? For a bunch of different gods who are constantly squabbling like a bunch of supernatural congressmen? What does God look like? If you were to draw God, what would you draw? Just out of curiosity, a couple of years ago, I did a Google search for pictures of God, and about a third of the results looked something like this: a steep mountain peak. It's solid and strong and immovable, like God himself. And it's dangerous, disinterested, forbidding, and far away from our little lives down below. Is that what you think God is like? Cold? Callous? Unconcerned? I say about a third of the pictures in my unscientific survey were of mountains, but another third were a variety of cloud images, like this one. Most often, they were angry storm clouds with rays of light streaming through. These images capture God's mystery and power and his light that overcomes darkness, as we read in today's scripture. But they also suggest that he's as fickle as the Boston weather, ominous, faceless, and far away. This is important because if we don't even know what God looks like, we won't be able to find him or them, even if they're right in front of us. I was so intrigued by these pictures that I poked a little further and found a research study documenting that people of different ages tend to draw God very differently. Young children often imagine God as a person and associate him with love. Older children associate him with power. Adults, however, cease to depict God as personal and tend to draw God as inanimate objects, like mountains and storm clouds and oceans. A few years ago, I asked my then 6-year-old to draw a picture of God, but gave him no other instructions or ideas. Immediately, he knew what to do. He drew a picture of a large person hugging a smaller person. And I really like that image. That's what I want God to be like. But my liking it doesn't make it right. What does God really look like? How can we know? It shouldn't be so hard, because right in the very beginning, God gave the world a self-portrait. The three-in-one God, Father, Son, Spirit, who constantly love and serve each other, said, "Let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness." And apparently, God does not look most like a mountain or storm cloud or sunlight. In order to show what God is like, the Holy One made people in relationships who could love, serve, and enjoy each other. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Note that both male and female were required to illustrate what God is like, because neither could adequately represent God on their own. And no hermaphrodite would suffice either, because the essential point is their intimate relationship and their mutual dependence that create new life. They are two that operate as one to create three. And the qualities we generally associate with both masculinity and femininity express what God is like, not one or the other. And this means that despite the traditional use of masculine pronouns for God, because we just don't have any pronouns in English that incorporate both genders, both masculine and feminine pronouns can reveal things about God and obscure them. I've yet to find a better solution than to use the masculine pronouns, but I know from Genesis that solution is flawed and often pushes us to exaggerate traditional masculine attributes like strength and authority and anger, while obscuring God's compassion, patience, and motherly love. Neither is more true than the other, and both are essential. And this matters because one theologian warned that when God is male, then male is God, which is bad for all of us. When God is reduced to a projection of hypermasculinity, we start to value things like power more than we value mercy. And in that moment, we distort God's image and then justify acting like the God we invented. This week in our capital, we saw the way that we understand God has very practical consequences. Given that they were created to reflect God's image, it's odd that we never hear what Adam and Eve looked like. Did they begin with long, flowing hair, or did they start out bald? Were they created as babies or as fully formed adults? What race were they? Black, brown, white, Asian, or something else? Were they even the same race? We don't know. Apparently none of those are what it means to reflect God. All we know is that they were distinct but interdependent, bound by love, and commanded to create like God did and to care for all that God created. Those characteristics are what it means to be made in the likeness of God. Well, in any case, it turns out that although they were created to reflect God, they didn't do that very well. Unlike the God they were supposed to reflect, they became selfish and sinful, power-hungry and unkind. They alienated and deceived each other, and they hid from God. They were the original sinners. But every one of us since has done the very same thing. And the result you'd expect from that is exactly the world that we have today. Wars, divorce, disease, despair, broken families, broken hearts, poverty, pollution, racism, and injustice. Meanwhile, we've forgotten who we really are, the children of God. So we vacillate between excessive pride and crippling insecurity, and we feel deeply alone because our relationships with God and each other are broken. You may not use the word sin very much, but you probably recognize its symptoms. So many people today struggle with identity. We don't know whom we should be. We try on various identities in search of one that fits or wins approval from our friends. The reason we don't know who we are is that we've forgotten who God is, what God is like. How can I reflect someone if I don't really know what they look like? Ideally, looking at other people should remind us of what God is really like because we were made to reflect God's image to each other. But our selfishness and sin have obscured God's reflection so that most of us, including our parents, politicians, our pastors, even our spouses, don't end up looking much like God at all. And the fact that so many heinous things have been done in the name of God further confuses us. All religions have done this, and many Christians did this week. Taken together, these things gradually warp our image of God. Certainly we can get clues about God's creativity and power and love of beauty from looking at the universe he made. But obviously this isn't enough, because many people have admired creation but missed God, or simply misunderstood him. They worried that he was angry or dead or just disinterested. As we read in verse 10 of our scripture reading, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. So I ask you, what's God really like? How would you draw God? And how could you be sure that's really right? Because what makes your opinion, or mine, better than any other? After all, aren't we all just making our best guesses based on our own intuition and experiences? So a lot of us just give up guessing. We give up looking. We may long for the fulfillment and life that many people claim to find in God, but we don't know where to look for that or whom to trust to guide us. Instead, we just get used to feeling empty and vulnerable, alone. God saw this problem and came up with an ingenious, if unexpected, solution. Those of you who are friends with my wife on Facebook know that we had a funny experience recently. A bird flew into our house. It was flying all around frantically while our golden retriever sprinted back and forth trying to follow it, terrifying the bird even more. I opened the door hoping that the bird would fly back to safety, but it didn't seem to realize that that was the way home, and it refused to go through. So then I started chasing the bird to steer it toward the door, but that didn't work and only made it more afraid of me. I resolved that the only way to solve this problem would be to catch the bird. But that was surprisingly difficult. They are fast, especially when they're frightened. And it kept flying and perching above my head out of reach. After more than 30 minutes of this, both the bird and I, and the dog, were exhausted. So I sat down to figure out what I could do next. And I remembered a sermon illustration I've shared in the past that some of you know, but which suddenly felt more relevant. If you don't know it, all that matters is that the main character in that story was also trying to help a bird to no avail, and finally thinks, if only I could become a bird, then I wouldn't be so scary, because I'd be a bird just like that one. She'd let me fly up right next to her, and in her own language, I could signal that I understand her predicament, that she's lost and feels trapped. But I know the way out. Then I could fly right through the open door while the other bird watches to see that I made it so that she would have the confidence to try it too. I could even fly back in briefly just to prove that it's safe. And I bring this up because my dilemma that day is similar to the one God faced. Despite all that God had said through the Bible so far, people still didn't understand what God was like, because he seemed so big and so different and so dangerous, just like I must have seemed to that bird. So in order to save us from the mess we'd made, God became a human, a person like us, to show us what he really looks like and to lead us back home. And that's why Jesus is such a big deal. Much better than guesses from experts, Jesus is God's way of showing us what he's really like and how to be saved from our loneliness and hopelessness and our final enemy, death itself. In Jesus, God would show us himself and then show us the way. In John 1, earlier, we read that the Word was with God and was God. In Greek, the language the New Testament was originally written in, the word for word is logos, which could be translated as something like wisdom, reality, or truth. We see it in our English word biology, right? Bios, the Greek word for life, and logos, so the truth about life. Today, however, we use the word logo directly in English to refer to something that visually represents something bigger. You know, the idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Some corporate logos don't necessarily tell you much about the company. For example, from looking at the Netflix logo, I have no idea what they do or sell, or the Old Navy logo. But most brands put a lot of thought into their logos in order to introduce you to the purpose and values of the company. Some of the best known include FedEx, whose logo includes an arrow in the negative space between the E and the X, or Amazon, which sells everything from A to Z. One of my favorites is the pair of logos for the Bronx Zoo, which depict animals with the skyscrapers of New York in the negative space. In one look, you can tell what the zoo's all about, bringing wild animals right into the heart of the city. A great logo reveals what it represents. And in this way, Jesus is the perfect logo for God because Jesus shows us what God is really like. We read earlier that, verse 14, that word or logos, the truth about God, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Paul described Jesus as the visible image of the invisible God. After all of our guesses, finally, God came in a form that we could see and touch and understand, like I wanted to do with that bird. Mysteriously, Jesus was human and God at the very same time. In Jesus, God looked like us. He spoke our languages and shared the experience of being human, which includes feeling loneliness and longing and pain. You could imagine that if God comes to earth, he'd want to be treated appropriately, certainly better than any human, even better than any human king. But Jesus wasn't like that. God chose to come as a regular person, without any prestige or special privileges. In fact, he came as a poor person in an oppressed nation. He came as a baby who was weak and dependent on the humans he'd created. Think about how strange that is. God so loved the world that he was willing to get diaper rash and teased as a child. He got blisters and bee stings and betrayed by his closest friends and beaten by soldiers. The first Christmas after adopting 3 teenagers from a refugee camp in Africa, our family decided to read the Christmas story together during Advent. And when I read the part about Jesus being born among the animals and laid in a feeding trough, my African kids started chatting among themselves frantically in their own language. And they were new to English, so they asked me to clarify what I meant. Jesus was basically born in a barn? Yes. More charged chatter. Finally, they declared indignantly, no, God would never do that. It's disgusting. I'd always imagined the manger scene to be so sweet and sterile, but they'd lived with animals not so long ago, so they knew the reality. God would never stoop that low. It made no sense. I get it. From looking at the majesty of creation, I think that's beneath God too. I imagine God more like a demanding king shouting orders angrily. So God came as Jesus to show us that's just not true. God is different from what most of us imagined. He wasn't irritable or aloof, as many people guessed God would be. Instead, Jesus was gentle, forgiving, and full of love. And Jesus confronted injustice with steely-eyed authority. As Jesus explained, he didn't come to condemn the world, as people expected, but to save the world. But it's funny, for all that was written about Jesus, no one ever mentioned what he looked like, physically. Did he have long hair, a long face, a long nose, a long beard? What do you think? Was he tall or short? Was he fat or skinny? We don't know. And the reason we don't know is that none of those things is what God looks like. Who Jesus is what God looks like. Sort of like my son's drawing suggested. The way Jesus lived and loves is what God looks like, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us, John writes. He sent his one and only Son into the world. Jesus is someone big hugging someone small. That's who God is. God is love. Lots of philosophers debated what God might be like, and the major world religions represent some of the very best guesses that humans could make. But Jesus is God coming to show us what he, she, they are really like, so that we could rely on something better than good guesses. Jesus didn't need to make any guesses about God, because in Jesus, God was describing himself. We read earlier that no one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father, has made him known. For the next few months, we're going to be getting to know Jesus better, because Jesus is the logo, the visible image of the invisible God. Jesus is what God is really like. Through Jesus, we discovered the God who is very different from what we'd imagined. Instead of anger and arrogance, we got Jesus, who is full of grace and truth. We're going to discover a lot more about Jesus in the next few months, but at the core of it all, we see that Jesus is full of grace and truth. That's who God really is. This matters, because in times when I wonder what God must think of me, in times when I worry that God must be as disgusted with me as I am, in times when I assume that God's just too big or far away to care about someone small like me, Jesus reminds me that the God who created the whole universe became a baby in a backwater barn so that we'd know there is no corner of the earth that God doesn't care about, and no person so small that they could ever be beneath him. Not even me, or you, or anyone. Lying in that hospital bed with my broken back, I eventually opened up my Bible in a last-ditch effort to ask where God could be in that situation. And what I kept finding was story after story of God with people who were suffering, rejected, and afraid. I recognized that Jesus didn't always prevent suffering, but shows up right in the middle of it to lead us through to new life on the other side. Well, that's not the God I initially expected or was looking for, but it's the one I've come to know and love ever since. Even now, in days when I start to get confused about who God really is, because of all the competing images of God in our culture today, or because I'm feeling lost for a moment and unsure of what I should be looking for, whenever that happens, I keep coming back to Jesus. That's the clearest image of God I'll ever find. I read through the Gospels again, and finding Jesus there helps me find him everywhere I go. Focusing on Jesus reminds me who I am created to be. That's what I hope happens for you as we study Jesus together this winter. In addition to our Sunday sermons, each weekday, our daily devotions will focus on the stories between our Sunday texts so that we can get a much fuller picture of who Jesus is. We've also prepared a companion guide that you can find on our website that you can use for your personal study or to go through with your family or small group. The bottom line is that we want to help you know Jesus better this year, because Jesus is the God that we're all looking for. And in Jesus, that God came looking for you.